welcome to another episode of Sabra. And we bring to you a very young, vibrant, and dynamic duo, Atreyo Banerjee and Shardha Rajam. So, a brief intro before we quickly dive into, knowing them better and getting insightful commentary on their work. So, Atreyo is a curator at Agami, where he co-leads the environmental justice mission. He has been associated with NLSIU Bangalore, where he has taught a course on politics and law in the climate crisis. On the other hand, Shardha works with Asia Pacific Forum on Women, Law and Development, a regional feminist organization on labor and migration issues. Previously, she has taught at the National Law School of India University as a visiting faculty. Once again, welcome, Atreyo and Shardha. Thank you for finding time for Sabra and making it here finally. Um, so I would like to know, on behalf of the Sabra team, I would like to know if you could take our viewers and listeners through your work, because although we have been, working on different aspects and entanglements of care, but post-humanism is new to us as well as for many of our viewers, even if people are from academia. So if you could just simplify it for everyone out there.
Well, thank you so much for having us, Shaindri, Devi, and the Sabra team. We are so excited to be here, and we've been looking at your website, and I think we have a lot to learn from it through some of the previous conversations you've had as well. So yes, I work with APWLD, and he works with Agami, and I wanted to start off our conversation with our fundamental understanding of care first. But before I continue, would you like to say something?
Yeah, no, sure. Again, thank you. Thanks a lot, Devi and Shayandri, for having us. I think what might also help is just sharing a little bit context about how both Shardha and I have arrived at this work through very, very different trajectories,
That'd be great.
So Devi, you used a very interesting way to describe us as a dynamic duo, but this dynamism has had a fairly checkered journey, and we've kind of arrived at it through very different ways. So, so the organization that I work with, Agami, and the work that I look at specifically there on environmental justice, it's actually around environmental justice innovation. So, and again, the word innovation, of course, has certain connotations, but the real thrust is that how could we rethink existing legal and justice systems in radically different ways? And one thing that I'm particularly co-leading with some other colleagues at Agami is it's called the Multi-Species Dispute Resolution Canvas. And I know it's a mouthful, but it's at the core of that work is to, number one, acknowledge that we live in a multi-species, entity relationship with the larger world around us, and often these relationships don't find way into our dominant paradigms of governance, law, justice, so on and so forth. So even this work and this paper, and of course I was not able to be at the presentation, but how we've arrived at it, at least for me, it's rooted a little bit in that context. And maybe Shardha, you'd like to share a little bit about how you've come into this.
Very quickly, I feel my kind of experience was a bit different in the sense that for me, I think lived experience came first and vocabulary and academia came later. So I started by interacting with the more than human lives around me through my pets, through my garden and the plants and insects around me, etc. So I think we've had different journeys, but now we find ourselves in a kind of similar path. But I'd like to kind of start by talking about our conceptualization of care, because I think that is immensely relevant before we move forward. So we understand care is a thick ethical concept, and we think care entails everything that is done to maintain, continue, and repair our world so that all of us can live in it as well as possible. It also means that it is happening at a multi-species level, and that it occurs at our bodies, within ourselves, and also at our environment. And all of this is a complex and sometimes difficult entanglement that we find ourselves in. And our understanding of care is not new. This is something that ecofeminists have been talking about for a while, and they have established that an interspecies ethics of care must exist, and they have started reconceptualizing our moral ties to non-humans. I also want to acknowledge that this means that we understand that there is a relationship, not one of exploitation from an intelligent species or by an intelligent species of an unintelligent or a species which is considered to be non-sentient, but rather at some level, a reciprocal relationship.
Yeah, no, and if I, sorry, Devi, were you going?
No, it's super helpful to have you lay it out, in terms of how you are approaching the concept of care. So that's super helpful. Thanks. Sorry, Atreyo, you were going to say something. Yeah.
No, just to add, in some sense, we have a huge debt to, of course, pay to different scholars and thinkers who've come before this piece and who've centered the very critical role that care sort of plays, right, in our larger financial, economic, social, political systems. The work that we are trying to also push forward in some sense is recognize that yes, care is emotional, care is affective, but care is also metabolic and care is also eco-social. So that's like the core pivot that we want to kind of push forward. And we feel there's a lot of value in recognizing more than human, other than human life forms, and the kind of metabolic labor that they do as care work. And we'll of course get into that. But just as how we see our work kind of build on to those who've come before us. So that's something that I'd like to add. Yeah.
So that's fascinating. Also, possibly largely my ignorance, because we have these conversations in academic kind of closed door conversations, right? We quote ecofeminists, we quote Marxists, but as I understand, both of you are from a law background.
Yeah.
So this is what I wanted to kind of maybe foreground, which is, how is it that we think about care when we're talking about justice? And it seems obvious, right? Like the two should go together, but often the way our systems work seem to be kind of at odds, right? The carelessness or the lack of care, the care deficit that exists in these justice systems that we have. So, maybe a little more about how is it that both of you, with your kind of training, come into this question of care, centering care. And I realized that Shardha said that it's her own lived experience, which is always important, right? I mean, our training is one thing, but then our lived experiences so contradict what we are taught, right?
Right.
But just you could tell us a little more about this.
Perhaps I can start, and please to add. Yes, our formal training as lawyers has definitely helped us to enter this conversation in a certain way. And how that way is, if you see how broadly, of course, we have lakhs and lakhs of different laws, but broadly, if I could categorize our environmental law paradigm, it's posited on the fact that there is a world outside which needs to be governed and which needs to be cordoned off or partitioned to the highest bidder in some sense, through a license regime, through an extractive regime, so on and so forth. Similarly, we also have, very extensive wildlife protection acts. We have extensive laws on agriculture and farm practices, so on and so forth. But if you see the purpose that which these laws, or rather the way in which how do I put it? The way in which these laws are, like, how would I know if these laws are successful? If these laws have achieved in perhaps apportioning the environment in a certain way, in protecting certain forms of wildlife over others. And what I'm trying to get to is that at best, we see these as very instrumental ecosystem services that some of these, the larger environment kind of plays around us. So if I take the example of, let's say, forests, in India, forests is a very political question. For a couple of reasons. Of course, it has a lot of value of its own, but also the fact that, they do a lot of carbon sequestration work, so on and so forth. Now, what is missing is seeing not forests as just a resource, almost like an inert piece of land, but the larger relational work which forests are kind of doing, which is so critical to our life forms. And we feel if we are able to make the argument that that is care work, similar to how so many other forms of gendered work has found its place within legal understanding, then that has severe policy and legal ramifications. Then our environmental law paradigm actually moves towards what I like to think of as a much more holistic, higher form of ethic, which I feel it's presently perhaps lacking.
Yeah.
But please do add if you
Yeah.
like to.
Yeah, I think I just have a few more things to add. I think because my experience in law school, especially through courses of environmental law and other maybe non-direct courses on environment, has been like a process of grieving, because there is, I think law school is experienced through absence, in the sense there is a very clear understanding of who the law is for, who creates the law, and what the law is going to be about. Therefore, while we can say that, oh, the law is kind of anthropocentric, between who is considered to be the center of the law and who is not, there is a wide range of people who are considered to be buffers between human and animal. Therefore, previously colonized people, indigenous people, native people, even women, people of intellectual disabilities, etc., are all considered to be people who lie between the white person, the white man who lies at the center of our legal system, and an animal which needs or deserves no value. So throughout our law school experiences, and I don't just here speak for myself, I think this is what my conversations with other lawyers and law students have come to. There seems to be a reinforcement of this binary. And while different categories of people who are now considered to be buffers have moved out of that buffer zone and started being recognized as humans, whether it is women who were previously considered to be chattel or property, or now children in some instances, one thing remains to be almost constant, which is that the other end of that spectrum has to be natural elements, has to be animals, whether sentient or not, or insects, fungal life, vegetal life, etc. So for me, that started becoming a problem once I started experiencing the more than human intelligences around me, which I don't think any other word captures aside from intelligence. So I think that's why it's important for lawyers and other social scientists to start talking about it, because the minute we stop questioning it, I wonder if we start reinforcing capital's narrative that nature exists as a freebie, as a resource that we must protect for our benefit. But yeah.
Sorry, I found that your work has resonance with Puek de la Bella Casa as well as Braidotti. And I mean, in both their works, what I have found is that they are taking a very different direction from that of that individualist notion that is rooted in, that liberal or libertarian politics for that matter. In what ways do you think that, it can help us to reimagine care, especially, like in your concept note that you have shared with us, you are talking about how this more than human partners or counterparts that we have, they are also serving as care recipients, right? So if you could elaborate on that.
Can I start? Yeah. Thank you, Chandri, because this is something that we thought about a bit deeply, because we don't want to fall into the trap of just adding animals or adding more than human life and then stir. So we wanted it to, first, the starting point is, of course, the materialist feminists, the feminists who advocated for wages for housework and social reproduction theorists who started this conversation. And the reason why they started talking about care was about the fact that capital has a facade of strength, but actually it has a lot of fragility because of its dependence on a range of human activity which is considered to be free. Similar to that, there is immense multi-species, interspecies activity that is happening, which is the basis of our current systems. Now, I can divide care into two ways. The first is direct care work, which is when, for instance, dogs or horses are employed in palliative care or in elderly care or in kind of psychotherapeutic care, etc. The more indirect care that we might receive from more than humans, as Atreyo was mentioning, is the metabolic or bodily labor that is happening at this interspecies level, which allows us to not just thrive, but to exist in the first place. There are a lot of scholars who talk about how if we didn't have fungal life in this world, we would most likely cease to exist, right? We have Merlin Sheldrake and a few other scholars who talk about specific beings in the world who make our life possible. Starting from that point, if we look at more than human care, we start denaturalizing the care that we are receiving, which is one of the core arguments or reasons for the wages for housework movement. So similar to the wages for housework movement, which was not really asking for, it was not an immediate ask for give us wages in return for this housework. It was the start of a larger political conversation to acknowledge that without this labor, capital would kind of fall apart. Similar to that, we think it is not that now cows should be given a wage or that dogs must be given pension and social security benefits. The idea is that we have to acknowledge and denaturalize this care in the first place. We also think that this allows for the possibility of collaborative resistance, because the minute we think of more than humans as giving us care, we acknowledge intelligence. We acknowledge that these are, and this is not just restricted to sentient beings or beings that we consider sentient. It includes a range of beings that we now don't know for sure whether they are sentient or not. For instance, insects. So if we start looking at more than human intelligence, we can quite conveniently move forward to think about more than human resistance and the ways in which other workers, other laborers within capital can perhaps collaborate with these kind of intelligent life forms.
Yeah. No, maybe I could also just perhaps take a step back. I feel because Shaindri, you also brought out Brad Ottie's work on the post-human, and some parts of our work is also quite influenced by the post-human and Donna Haraway's work, especially because essentially what like our reading of this scholarship is that they're decentering the human, but not in the sense, or not only in the sense that we are imbricated in the world around us, but almost like what they're calling as decentering, I like to think as recentering. It's almost like you're recentering the human as a ecologically embedded human being. So, and like one thing that I feel our work aims to contribute to is that how would a justice or a legal question look different if you center not just the individuated anthropos in the center, but if you center it basis an ecologically embedded human? And to answer your question, this how do you become, or how do you start recognizing that you are ecologically embedded? It is through these constant, like this reciprocal arrangements of care that the larger world is kind of, and you're always in reciprocity of these relations. So that is something which we have relied on from the scholarship which kind of comes before this. And what we like to, or how we are also developing this in some sense, is to say that we firstly, of course, recognizing this messy, fuzzy state of entanglement, but to also say that what this messy, fuzzy entanglement means for legal questions around labor and legal questions, and not even just legal questions, rather legal and governance questions of labor, and especially of value. Because the question of value is very central to our work, and I'm happy to get into it more, but yeah, just to foreground that bit.
Yeah, and just one point that I missed earlier was that the fact is that more than humans are already being put to work in different contexts, in caregiving contexts or as farm animals. But the theory of, or the lens of care and social reproduction seems to be more nascent when we start talking about them, because there seems to be a divide where the human is considered as exceptional and away from nature, and everything else which supports this human is unintelligent. So I think if we are already putting a range of beings to work, it is important to understand what that work is. Yeah.
No, this is fascinating at so many levels, because we've been among ourselves having these conversations about care, some degree of conversations about more than human questions about how we approach care. But we haven't really centered the question of the law and justice here. And I think this is kind of opening so many doors for me, or at least pointing me to doors that have been shut so far, right? Even if not opening them yet. But I was, it just also reminded me, I don't know if you've come across Yuval Aves's book. I don't know if I'm pronouncing his name correctly, called
Yes, yes.
Title.
Yeah.
But again, that's a beautiful book in the last year, which just kind of made me think about how I've been missing on so many things that are just there in front of you, right? And so many things that just help us survive. We're not even thinking about thriving or just, it's just your everyday forms of coping with this world. And so in many ways, this is conversations around alternative justice, if you may, right? Is that a fair term to use?
I think there was this one beautiful question rather, that I had read, that does a legal methodology for more than human need, does a law for more than human need a methodology beyond law? And what that question sort of pushes us to think is that our legal systems, just going back to something I think Shardha also touched on in the beginning, when she was mentioning the point on grief, right? It's not that our legal systems don't, or our justice systems don't consider emotion. The catch is that it considers a certain kind of disembodied, rational, reasonable man standard of emotion. And what this work aims to do, and of course building on other work, it's complicating that to show that these other forms, grief, pain, loss, are equal voices which are around. And the law in some sense needs to open up to make sense of that. So I wouldn't call it alternative justice. I would just call it that in our paradigms of different justice, because these are not, again, I must deeply caveat and situate this. This is not new. These are cosmologies which very much exist both in our country and of course across the world. So the challenge really has been that these colonial systems of law, which have become what's called as formal law, sort of furthers this idea of law as very rationalist, very disembodied. What we want to do is bring or surface that these other forms of justice, which centers other life, other forms of relation making with the world around us, how could that center itself in the legal system? So
yeah, I want to start by kind of acknowledging what you said earlier about, we start seeing these things, maybe not through training or in school classrooms, etc., but like at a different level. And we come to it often much later than what we would have. And I think that's it's by design. It is not a coincidental or an incidental action, right? So I think that's important to mention, that I think invisibilization of these other lives around us is a necessary foundation on which capital rests, because invisibilization can mean that cruelty, abuse, expropriation of that labor can now go without any resistance by humans. That is the first thing. The second, I want to also kind of elaborate a bit more on why the current justice system may not fully understand this, because we might have different audiences and with different trainings. Because when we look at environment and environmental law in the current legal system, it is, first of all, the human continues to be the intermediary for all of these other voices. And this intermediary role is also dependent on which human is talking about them. If you're looking at urban, upper and middle class individuals who are bringing these cases to court about like pollution, etc., there is a very clear disjunct between those kind of cases and those in which the Adivasi or an indigenous person is bringing that case to court, which is very rare, but their experience with nature is entirely different, which is not like always self-centered. It is more looking at it in terms of the embedded human being that Atreyo spoke about. And similarly, I feel some of the environmental law cases that we have had, whether in the National Green Tribunal or in different fora across India, has always looked at deforestation or other extraction from nature as compensatable or like recommensurable, which means that if a forest is cut in one part of Delhi, it can always be planted somewhere else in a different part. So I think there are some of these challenges which exist in the current legal system, and it's important to acknowledge that this exists. But then, as Atreyo mentioned, that there are some specific entry points that have already slowly started. An example a very quick example is that in Ecuador, in the Copyright Office, a forest has been kind of roped in as a co-creator of a song. So if the copyright is granted, the forest is a copyright owner because the background of the song involves sounds of the forest, including like birds chirping, etc. So these kind of rights of nature cases have started looking at beyond human legal subjectivity.
So I have a follow-up question in a different way. Like we all know what is currently going on in the Kanchi Gachibowli area of Hyderabad. We have again, we are fraught with the question of humanization of nature and how natural spaces are being, redesigned and maneuvered. And something like greenwashing as a term has also popped up recently. If you could, take us through, what is going on, especially through a post-humanist lens, and how do we look at it?
No, that's a very alive and a fantastic question. So maybe just I want to kind of give a little bit more context. I feel what's happening at Hyderabad is both very stark, simply because of the scale of violence with which the state has kind of fallen on the students and everybody else who are standing in protest, but also not at all surprising because there is a break between environmental law and environmentalism in how it has kind of happened I would like to think from perhaps in the last century, but I would restrict myself to a post-independence context. So honestly, what's happening at Hyderabad follows a very templatized playbook, almost like a massacre playbook of sorts. And if you just see some of our biggest environmental law cases, we can start perhaps with Chipko, and then there's Narmada Bachao Andolan, then what happened at Kodai Canal with mercury poisoning. And there are just so many. So these are just like the more national, which captured national imagination, but these are examples everywhere. The template is almost always the same. There is a legal language of clearances which have been done away with, or land which has been given to the highest bidder, land which has been taken away and purportedly given for the greater good of a certain kind of development, which is usually an IT park or in the Hyderabad case, I think they wanted to also resort to, what was that, like a resort park or something like that. But the template continues to be the same. The template continues to actually move away from this idea of environmentalism towards, this what is happening is legal. It is sanctioned by the law's judicial fiat in some sense. So in that sense, I feel it is as expected, and I think Hyderabad is just a start of perhaps many more things which is yet to come. On the other hand, I feel what seeing it in a post-humanist way could kind of offer us is go back to that idea that, or what I am trying to call as environmentalism, which is that we need to go back to that relation that this is, number one, you need to think of property differently. What is property if it's not individual property? What if we could have something like commons, which is again something which other organizations and communities in India are working strongly for. Number two, you need to rethink paradigms of course, development, and hardly the first person to say this, like this is fairly well, but this idea that whose conceptions of development matter changes drastically when you think of post-humanist thought that the human is not at the hierarchy. The human is on a spectrum of many other life forms. So any conception of development that kind of emerges from that would need to take account of that spectrum and not that pyramid in some sense. But I'll pause, and maybe if you would like to add something.
Yeah, I think that's a fascinating question, and honestly, Atreyo has worked on that aspect a lot more than I have. But I agree to the extent that yes, it is a pattern, and I think it is through the instrumentalization of law that this is possible. Like the Forest Conservation Amendment Act, the Environmental Impact Assessment, there are different notifications that keep getting released. And in the course of just a few years, that notification has received some 100 different amendments, and literally 100. So I think it is very difficult to work with a legal system which is designed to usurp, which is designed to expropriate. So I think that's a very pertinent question given what's happening. But I am also appreciative of the kind of protests that we are currently seeing and the stop that the Supreme Court has ordered already.
No, but the whole idea of collaborative resistance is something that has kind of stayed with me since you mentioned it. And I was wondering if you could tell us a little more about how you imagine this collaborative resistance.
Well, it's a bit difficult to say it right now without sounding like as if this argument is based on fantasy.
Okay.
Because I feel
curious. Like I'd love to know more.
I think it is we are so divorced from thinking about the intelligence of other species that sometimes it can be a bit difficult. But Dinesh Vadivel in his book on it's called The War Against Animals talks about the immense resistance that has been provided by different animals. And one of the examples he focuses on is farm animals, and he talks about how animal behaviorists actually make it very difficult for animals to resist. So in the sense, if a cow is supposed to go straight for the cow to be butchered, the behaviorists have suggested that the path be a little convoluted with twists and turns so that the animal is not able to see what lies at the end of it, which might make it look like in these industrial complexes there is no resistance at all. But he talks about why that method was designed in the first place to avoid that resistance. Similar to that, the broiler chicken. And these are conversations that have started by Dinesh Vadivel, yes, but also Man Barua, where he talks about how broiler chickens are kind of almost a part of our Anthropocene now. And if you think about it geologically, our era is kind of dominated by chicken bones. So that is one interesting thing. But maybe one of the ways of resistance is something that I'm going to think about for one more minute before I'm able to answer that more fully. Yeah, or Atreyo can jump in.
Yeah, I mean, I think perhaps just to add, like, one thing is that our ecosystems do resist. It's the language that we can label it as a natural disaster. But I'll give an example of, I mean, the COVID-19 pandemic, right? Essentially, it's a direct show of resistance in some sense, because if forests are being reduced, then the chances of a zoonotic spillover is that much more. And I think the idea of collaboration, or the duty that we have perhaps as human beings, or belonging to a certain class of humanity rather, is recognize that, okay, when the river is overflowing, when there is immense inundation, that is ecosystem resistance in some way. And can we tie our resistance similarly? So there is this whole range of thought which is talking about something called eco feedback, that if there is a forest fire, one does not need to legalize it and take it to court in a certain form or speak a certain language of evidence which only the court understands, which also means there are many intermediaries in the way, right? There's an advocate, there's a senior advocate, there's a court physical location. But how do you make sense of resistance in itself as evidence? Like, can you reduce that time? I like to think of it that, can the forest just walk into the court, or the court come to the forest immediately? Because as I don't know if this sounds trivial, but we live in moments of such a urgent crisis, almost like a poly crisis, that we need to rethink these paradigms. So
Reminded of this beautiful book that I don't know if you've seen this one. This is by Julian Agwan. I'm not sure I'm pronouncing it correctly, but No Country for Eight-Spot Butterflies. And it's a beautiful book that I'd super recommend, but it was just something that when you were talking about collaborative resistance, both of which I like as a term, it just reminded me of this wonderful writing, which is filled with poetry, but also just of resistance of indigenous peoples with the system that they live in, right? But I mean, are you in the middle of writing this up? Are you ready to share your work with the world? Have you already written that? Something you want to talk about?
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, I actually thought of a response to one of the questions that you asked, the resistance. Actually, I remembered a few pieces that I had read. One of them is called How Trees Communicate, and they talk about how we might think that trees don't resist or they don't talk. But there was a very beautiful example of how acacia trees, when they were, when giraffes started eating them, they started releasing a scent within a few minutes, so that the giraffes not only stopped eating those leaves, but had to go up to 100 yards away from that whole cluster of acacia trees to be able to feed on the next whatever else that they had to feed on. This is just a small example, but I think if we take it with respect to the human natural resistance, I think the Chipko movement is a fantastic example where there was a conversation which started with nature culture because these women were tying rakhis to the tree. So it's like a relationship of protection, but very surprisingly, they thought the forest was protecting them and therefore they had to protect the forest. So I feel that was a collaborative example. And I think many more can exist in that same vein. Yeah. And your question, what was the other question about?
Where's our work?
Where's our work? Okay. That is very exciting because right now we are in the middle of, establishing a collective. Yes. So with respect to this piece, we do intend to publish it alongside the other pieces that were presented at the CARE convening, the CARE debates that happened at the Institute of Human Settlements. We intend to do that. And we are also trying to refine our piece we both are taking a course by the Earth Law Center, which talks about the rights of nature, which talks about the eco-jurisprudence that is currently developing at a global level. So we are hoping that this piece gets refined and, we have conversations with others who believe in or are discussing more than human labor as well.
Wonderful, because I hope that this becomes like a growing conversation. I feel like one that needs to be integrated into any question of care, but also questions of justice, right? So is that something that you take to the classroom as well, Atreyo? Like you teach, and I'm wondering if...
Yes, definitely. Actually, although my course is called Politics and Law in the Climate Crisis, the approach is that I use climate change as almost a segue into all of these questions in a different. So the course is actually structured in a way which starts with acknowledging that we live in a polycrisis and how climate change allows us that lens to see that. And then it moves on to first, it talks about the role which legal systems have played in constituting this crisis. And it's only after that we go and see, okay, how can the legal system be an ally or what would justice as an ally really look like? And then move to new paradigms of justice. So I use it I almost use it as a provocation of sorts where I use climate change because it's also easy see, a lot of the times I also have to be mindful that ultimately I'm also teaching undergraduate and young students in that sense. So the approach also needs to be something which captivates their imagination, but it's a great place to then put this thinking. And I've seen some really, really awesome participation from them when we've centered some of these questions.
Yeah, that was going to be my follow-up query to you that, how do students receive it? Because, I mean, some of these conversations can be so generative, right? And then students make you think in particular kinds of ways, like pushback. Just their resistance to some of these ideas can also make you think about how to,
I think the hardest thing, if I can be very candid, the hardest thing, and it perhaps is not related to only the course I taught. I'm sure this is, I know for a fact that this is something which is prevalent in at least my law school. There's a very strong focus of a law and what is understood as a law and efficiency approach. That the role of law is to further efficiency, further market hegemony of sorts. And that's it. The law should not so much be concerned with distributional questions because if you solve the market, the distribution gets sorted. The first couple of classes, I would like to say the first 1 or 2 modules, breaking that, grappling with that was a little tricky. Rewarding, yes, because when you see that, okay, you're being able to kind of move together collectively, both my thinking and their thinking is resulting into something better than the sum total of its parts. That was definitely rewarding, but that is challenging because you are dealing with an institutional setup across different colleges and schools in the country. So
No, we should have a separate conversation, like a care convening on the question of efficiency alone, because we talk about it in healthcare. Again, I'm sure you're familiar with the notion of, market efficiencies in the healthcare sector, and then you have that discourse itself. So this is something I grapple with as well, right? The question of efficiency and markets integrated into the healthcare sector, just taken as an assumption, right? That's the only way things work. Just curious, is that a recent discourse, or in the last couple of decades, this whole question of efficiency in the legal system, or?
Yes. So there's a fantastic paper which is called Beyond the 20th Century Synthesis. I'm happy to share it with you. It's a seminal piece of work in many ways, but its key contribution has been it's taken political economy and it's shown that how law, and there are other people also. There's another book called Code of Capital by Katharina Pister, but essentially these works are moving towards showing that what a absolutely critical role law has played in coding capital, coding the market, creating the rules of play, creating rules of market exchange. And that thought has, I don't see that thought very dominant in this, like in India and the global South in general, but it is a it's a fairly emergent, powerful global movement otherwise.
Shaindri, did you have anything to add?
I think I will act as the snooze alarm and inch closer toward the closing question rather. So I'm interested to know what, made you to collaborate together. I mean, you also have a personal aspect to it. So if you are comfortable sharing it, I mean, there's no pushing on our end, but we would like to know that, collaboration is also about, sometimes taking those tough decisions and having those sparks, and sometimes you don't, get along as well. So there are divergences as well. So if you could take us through that process and how we can think of care when we are collaborating together.
Yeah, I think I have thought a lot about this because I think as early career researchers, we are kind of struggling with forming our own identities and our own scholarship while also being mindful of the power of collaboration, how collaborative pieces tend to be qualitatively very different from individual pieces. That is the first. But the more personal aspect of it is we both share a household. We both have two dogs that we are taking care of, and an everyday interaction that we have through the dogs with the rest of the urban world has kind of brought us together in the sense we walk our dogs, and this is something that we are writing on currently. We walk our dogs and we see, off late, we see children yelp at them from several feet away. We see people point and, they treat the dogs as spectacle. And my problem with that is that means you've not grown up, or you don't think of more than humans as companions. You think of them as spectacular others. You think of them as, can I stop and click a picture with this? So I think those experiences, although personal, allowed us to start with this framing of why it is important to start looking at the companion species within law. That is the first. And I think the second is, of course, I feel often these conversations like get reduced to pets or get reduced to what we consider sentient beings, which is something that I don't want to do, because beyond just these animals that we take care of, there is also like a garden that we are taking care of the plants around us. We are taking care of each other in a very different way. So I think we receive the bounties of the plants around us. And I don't just mean oxygen, I don't just mean shade on a hot day like someday this week, but also fruits, bilateral fruits. Like last week, we harvested bananas. So I think while this may seem very disjunct and entirely personal, I think each element has added an important facet into the larger conversation. I think if I didn't experience the world through these companions, through these beings around me, I would probably be stuck in doing law or doing social reproduction and thinking about social reproduction in an anthropocentric way myself, because that is how the system is designed, that we focus on the human drama of capital, care, resistance, feminism, etc. So I think for me, it is emanating out of that. Yeah.
I don't have,
Yeah.
I think I don't have much to add, but I think just an anecdote which might help is we've had very different law school journeys. I'm somebody who's dabbled in a bunch of different things. I have practiced as a formal lawyer. I have formal lawyer as in I used to litigate. I've worked on some issues of citizenship, gender, and in my head, always struggled with that. Am I a critical citizenship scholar? Am I somebody looking at gender and law? Am I somebody rethinking legal systems or formal? So, and that kind of always that was hard, because you are constantly told that strategize, pivot yourself as one kind of a thing. But I think like what I learned from her is honoring perhaps the one thing that you do, but do it very well, but then keeping open these other things. So I think just allowing that collective strength has been very helpful for me. I'm not sure for how helpful it's been, but definitely when I'm just somebody who likes to do things collaboratively, because individually I can struggle a little bit. So I think
Thank you for that lovely answer to Shanji's question. Um, it is, we just have another question that we usually ask people who come join us on this conversation is if you would like to share something for the viewers and the listeners on anything that you've been watching or reading that you think is a great kind of takeaway for them as well.
I would suggest the Song of the Cedars that I mentioned to you about how the forest has been roped in as a co-creator. It's freely available. It's by Cosmo Sheldrake, and I can share a link, which if you would like, you can share as well. Yeah.
yeah. I mean, just this book I've just finished reading recently. It's called Animal Intimacies by Radhika Govindarajan.
Yeah.
I've been reading it like the chapters for many years now, but I ultimately finished the last chapter, and I think it's a phenomenal book to just understand everything really: justice, care. She's got a beautiful word in chapter 2 where she's talking about the relationship between this lady who's raising a goat for sacrifice, and the idea of mamta in the book. And I found it so fascinating that it's showing that you're raising that beast to kill the beast, but the love and care and affect that kind of goes into it, it's just so messy and complicated that I think it's something that I would very strongly recommend.
Thank you for the
Yeah, of course.
suggestion on the 8-spot butterfly. I'm definitely going to take a look at it.
Thank you for joining us. Shanji, did you want to add anything?
I think Atreyo and Shardha, they were phenomenal. I mean, both of you, I mean, you have opened up so many avenues for us to think about care beyond the human. And, you know, your work or the trajectory that you adopted, it also resonated with Maggie Fitzgerald's Care and the Pluriverse. And, you know, there are different universes, and each universe has their own conceptualizations of, you know, what is permissible, what is proscribed, the legalities of it that may not be part of the formal law, but the nature has its own law as well. And this intimate relation between the one who shares the land, the one who is not looking at the land as a mere resource. I think we have so much to, you know, think about, and, you know, I think we need another edition of interview with you guys so that, you know, we can do fully justice to everything that you have, you know, put forth for us to think and take back home.
That is very kind of you. Thank you.
And also thank you for being, I think, open-minded to have this conversation, because I think this is a kind of a challenging conversation. When I came to this idea first, I faced a lot of resistance in terms of, oh, but how do I translate this into, academic work? Or I had so many questions about what does resistance look like? Can care be unintentional? Does all caring have to be caring about along with caring for? So I do think it's a kind of what do you call, contested territory. So thank you for being open to some of the conversations that we brought forth.